In 1914, a young naval officer stood on the deck of HMS Queen Elizabeth and watched history turn. The ship beneath his feet was the most powerful warship ever built. It could sail faster, strike harder, and outlast any vessel on Earth. But there was something different about this ship, something that would change the fate of empires. The Queen Elizabeth did not burn coal. It burned oil. And Britain, the nation that had built the greatest empire the world had ever seen on mountains of coal, did not have oil. Not a single major field. Not one reliable domestic source. The young officer did not know it yet, but he was standing at the beginning of the end. For 2 centuries, Britain had ruled the world with coal. Coal powered the factories that made British goods. Coal powered the railroads that moved British armies. Coal powered the ships that carried the British flag to every corner of the earth. The empire was not built on valor alone. It was built on energy. It was built on the black rocks pulled from the ground beneath Yorkshire and Wales. But energy sources change. And when they do, empires fall. You have been told that empires collapse because of military defeat or moral decay. But empires collapse because they lose control of the energy that sustains them. You have been told that power comes from armies and navies. But power comes from the ability to move, to build, to produce. And that ability comes from energy. What if the story of Britain's decline is not about 2 world wars or decolonization? What if it is about something simpler and more brutal? What if Britain fell because it built everything on coal, and then the world stopped using coal? What if the same pattern is happening right now, but with a different fuel and a different empire? What if the United States, which built its dominance on the dollar's relationship with oil, is standing where Britain stood in 1914? And what if most people cannot see it because the mechanism is invisible until it is too late? In the next 20 minutes, you will see how energy dependence creates empire and how energy transition destroys it. You will understand why Britain, despite winning 2 world wars, lost its empire. You will see the invisible architecture that connects fuel sources to financial power. And most importantly, you will see why this pattern is repeating right now, in real time, as nations across the world begin to trade energy in currencies other than the United States dollar. This is not a story about the past. This is a story about what happens when the foundation of power shifts beneath an empire's feet. In 1870, Britain was not merely powerful. It was incomparable. The British Empire controlled 1/4 of the world's land surface and 1/5 of its population. The Royal Navy commanded the seas without rival. British banks financed railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, ports in India. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. If a merchant in Singapore wanted to buy cotton from Egypt, he paid in pounds. If a government in Brazil wanted to build infrastructure, it borrowed in pounds. British power was not just military. It was structural. It was woven into the fabric of global commerce. But beneath this power was a simple material reality. Britain ran on coal. Every factory in Manchester, every locomotive on the Great Western Railway, every steamship crossing the Atlantic burned coal. And Britain had coal in abundance. By the late 19th century, Britain was producing over 250 million tons of coal per year. The coal seams beneath the British Isles were among the richest in the world. The empire had built itself on this geological accident. The steam engine, invented to pump water from British coal mines, had evolved into the technology that powered industrial civilization. And Britain owned both the fuel and the technology. Coal was not just an energy source. It was the foundation of British geopolitical strategy. The Royal Navy maintained coaling stations across the world. In Gibraltar, in Malta, in Aden, in Singapore, and Hong Kong. These stations were more than refueling points. They were choke points. They were leverage. A rival navy could build ships, but without access to coal in the right places, those ships could not project power globally. Britain controlled the coaling infrastructure. Britain controlled the seas. The two facts were inseparable. Coal made the empire possible. The empire made coal dominance possible. It was a reinforcing system, and it seemed permanent. But even in 1870, a problem was emerging. It was not visible to most observers. It was not discussed in Parliament or debated in the press, but it was real. Britain's coal production had peaked in relative terms. The country was still producing more coal than ever, but other nations were catching up. The United States, with its vast Appalachian coal fields, was increasing production rapidly. Germany, newly unified and industrializing at breakneck speed, was opening new mines in the Ruhr Valley. Russia was developing coal resources in Ukraine. The British advantage was eroding. More importantly, the technology was changing. Engineers were experimenting with internal combustion engines. These engines did not burn coal. They burned petroleum derivatives, gasoline, diesel, fuel oil, and petroleum offered advantages that coal could not match. It had higher energy density. A ton of oil contained more usable energy than a ton of coal. It was easier to transport. It could be pumped through pipes, stored in tanks, moved in tankers. It did not require an army of stokers shoveling fuel into furnaces. A ship powered by oil needed a smaller crew, carried more cargo, traveled faster, and had greater range. Militarily, oil was superior. Economically, oil was superior, and Britain did not have it. The first warnings came from the Royal Navy. In the early 1900s, Admiral John Fisher, First Sea Lord, began advocating for the conversion of the fleet from coal to oil. Fisher was not a romantic. He was a strategist. He understood that naval supremacy depended on technological advantage, and oil-powered ships were better. They accelerated faster. They required less maintenance. They could outmaneuver coal-burning rivals. Fisher commissioned studies. He ran tests. He built experimental vessels. The results were undeniable. Oil was the future. But oil came with a problem. Britain had coal mines. Britain did not have oil fields. In 1911, Winston Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty. He was 36 years old, ambitious, and convinced that Britain's naval supremacy was under threat. Germany was building a modern fleet. The United States was expanding its navy. Japan had emerged as a Pacific power. Britain's advantage was slipping. Churchill listened to Fisher. He studied the evidence, and he made a decision that would reshape the empire's future. He ordered the construction of a new class of battleships powered entirely by oil. The Queen Elizabeth class, the most powerful warships ever built, and the most vulnerable. The decision was controversial. Critics in Parliament warned that Britain was abandoning its natural advantage. Coal was British. Oil was foreign. Britain controlled coal production. Britain did not control oil production. By switching to oil, Britain was making its navy dependent on resources it did not possess. Churchill had an answer. Britain would secure oil. It would acquire oil fields. It would build an oil empire to match its coal empire. The strategy seemed sound. Britain had the financial power. It had the diplomatic reach. It had the military force. Surely it could secure the oil it needed. And for a time, it worked. Britain moved aggressively into the Middle East. It negotiated concessions with Persia. It signed agreements with Arab leaders. It used diplomatic pressure, financial inducements, and when necessary, military intervention to secure access to oil. In 1914, the British government took a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later known as British Petroleum. Britain had oil, not on British soil, but under British control. The empire had successfully adapted, or so it seemed. But control is not the same as ownership. Independence is not the same as mastery. The First World War proved Churchill right and wrong simultaneously. Oil-powered ships performed brilliantly. The Queen Elizabeth-class battleships were faster and more effective than their coal-burning predecessors. The Royal Navy maintained its dominance. Britain's ability to secure oil from Persia and other sources was critical to victory. Without oil, the war effort would have collapsed. Churchill's gamble had paid off, but the war also revealed a deeper problem. Britain had won, but it had won by depending on resources it did not fully control. After the war, oil consumption exploded. Automobiles, which had been luxury items before 1914, became mass consumer products. Airplanes, which had been experimental curiosities, became commercial and military necessities. Trucks replaced horse-drawn carts. Tractors replaced animal labor. The entire infrastructure of industrial society was shifting from coal to oil, and the shift was accelerating. By 1930, oil was no longer a niche fuel for navies and automobiles. It was becoming the foundation of the global economy. And Britain, despite its efforts, did not control enough of it. The United States, by contrast, was swimming in oil. Massive fields in Texas, California, and Oklahoma produced more petroleum than the rest of the world combined. American companies, Texaco, Gulf, Standard Oil, dominated global markets. The United States did not need to secure foreign oil. It had domestic abundance. This was not a minor advantage. It was a structural transformation of geopolitical power. Energy independence meant economic independence. It meant strategic autonomy. It meant that the United States could operate without the vulnerabilities that Britain now faced. The balance of power was shifting, and it was shifting because of geology. Britain tried to adapt. It expanded its Middle Eastern holdings. It negotiated new concessions in Iraq, in Kuwait, and the Gulf states. British oil companies became global players. British refineries processed petroleum from around the world. But there was a fundamental asymmetry. The United States produced oil on its own territory. Britain controlled oil in territories it did not own. This distinction seemed minor. It was not. Control through empire requires constant maintenance. It requires military presence. It requires political management. It requires the ability to defend supply lines and suppress local resistance. All of this is expensive. All of this is fragile. By 1940, Britain was fighting for its survival. The Second World War placed unprecedented demands on British resources. The Royal Air Force needed aviation fuel. The Royal Navy needed fuel oil. The Army needed diesel and gasoline. British factories needed energy to produce weapons. All of this required oil, and Britain was importing almost all of it. The supply lines stretched across the Atlantic through submarine-infested waters, vulnerable to German U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic was fundamentally a battle over energy logistics. Britain survived because the United States supplied oil. American tankers, American petroleum, American energy kept Britain in the war. The war ended in victory, but the victory masked a transformation. Britain had won, but it had won as a dependent power. The United States had emerged as the dominant energy producer, the dominant industrial power, and the dominant military force. Britain still had its empire, but the empire was bankrupt. The war had cost everything. Britain owed massive debts to the United States. Its industrial base was damaged. Its population was exhausted. And most critically, it did not have the energy resources to rebuild. The pound, once the global reserve currency, was weak. The dollar was strong, and the dollar was backed by oil. In the decades after the war, Britain's position deteriorated steadily. The empire began to dissolve. India gained independence in 1947. African colonies followed in the 1950s and 60s. The Middle Eastern oil concessions, which Britain had fought so hard to secure, were nationalized one by one. Iran nationalized its oil industry in 1951. Iraq followed. Saudi Arabia took control of its resources. Britain, which had built its strategy on controlling foreign oil, found that control slipping away. The empire cannot hold, not because of moral failure, not because of military defeat, but because the economic foundation had shifted. By 1970, Britain was no longer an energy power. It imported oil. It imported coal. It had become a service economy, a financial center, but not an industrial power. The coal mines that had once employed over 1 million people were closing. The industrial cities of the north were in decline. The empire was gone. And the loss of the empire was directly connected to the loss of energy independence. Britain had built everything on coal. When the world moved to oil, Britain had tried to adapt by controlling foreign oil. But that control was temporary. It depended on imperial structures that were themselves unsustainable. When the empire fell, the energy control fell with it. Britain had lost the game. While Britain declined, the United States constructed a different kind of energy empire. It was not based on territorial control. It was based on financial architecture. And the key to this architecture was the petrodollar system. The system emerged in the 1970s at a moment of crisis. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the convertibility of the dollar to gold. The Bretton Woods system, which had made the dollar the global reserve currency because it was backed by gold, had collapsed. The dollar was now a fiat currency. It had value because people believed it had value. But belief is fragile. The United States needed a new foundation for dollar dominance. The solution was oil. In 1973 and 1974, the United States negotiated agreements with Saudi Arabia and other major oil producers. The terms were simple. Oil will be priced in dollars. Oil would be sold in dollars. Any country that wanted to buy oil, the most critical commodity in the global economy, would need dollars. This created structural demand for the dollar. Every nation needed energy. Energy required oil. Oil required dollars. Therefore, every nation needed dollars. The dollar became the global reserve currency not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by oil. This was the petrodollar system, and it was brilliant. The system had profound implications. The United States could print dollars, and other nations would accept them because those dollars were needed to buy energy. This gave the United States enormous economic leverage. It could run trade deficits without consequence. It could borrow at low interest rates. It could finance government spending without the constraints that other nations faced. The petrodollar system was not just an economic arrangement. It was a mechanism of power, and it made the United States the center of the global financial system, just as Britain had been the center a century earlier. But there was a difference. Britain's power had been built on controlling physical resources. America's power was built on controlling the currency in which resources were traded. For 50 years, the petrodollar system has functioned smoothly. The dollar has remained the dominant global currency. The United States has maintained its position as the financial hegemon. But the system depends on one critical condition. Oil must be traded in dollars. As long as that condition holds, the system works. But if that condition breaks, the system unravels. And that condition is beginning to break. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, quietly, inevitably. The same pattern that destroyed British coal dominance is now threatening American dollar dominance. And most people do not see it. In 2010, a group of emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, formalized a coalition. BRICS. The group was not initially focused on currency. It was a diplomatic and economic forum. But over time, the focus shifted. These nations, collectively representing billions of people and enormous economic output, began to question why their trade had to be conducted in dollars. Why should China buy oil from Russia in dollars when both countries could trade in their own currencies? Why should Brazil buy goods from India in dollars when they could use reais and rupees? The questions were simple. The implications were profound. By 2020, the shift was underway. China and Russia began conducting bilateral trade in yuan and rubles, bypassing the dollar entirely. Brazil and China signed agreements to settle trade in their own currencies. India started purchasing Russian oil in rupees. These were not symbolic gestures. They were structural changes. Each transaction conducted in local currencies was a transaction that did not require dollars. And each such transaction weakened the structural demand for the dollar that the petrodollar system had created. The system was not collapsing, but it was eroding, slowly, incrementally, irreversibly. In 2023, Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system, began accepting yuan for oil sales to China. This was a seismic shift. For 50 years, Saudi oil had been sold exclusively in dollars. The dollar-oil link was the foundation of American financial dominance. Now that link was weakening. Saudi Arabia was not abandoning the dollar, but it was no longer exclusively tied to it. The kingdom was diversifying. It was accepting other currencies. And if Saudi Arabia, the largest oil exporter, was willing to accept yuan, other producers would follow. The process had begun, and once begun, it is very difficult to reverse. The United States government has responded with a mix of denial and coercion. Sanctions have been imposed on countries that attempt to bypass the dollar. Diplomatic pressure has been applied to maintain dollar dominance. But these measures are symptoms of weakness, not strength. Britain in the 1930s also tried to maintain its empire through force and diplomacy. It did not work. When the structural foundation shifts, no amount of political maneuvering can restore it. The question is not whether the petrodollar system will weaken. The question is how quickly it will weaken and what the consequences will be. The parallel between Britain's coal dependence and America's dollar dependence is not perfect, but it is instructive. Both systems were built on a single foundation. For Britain, that foundation was coal. For the United States, it is the dollar's link to oil. Both systems created immense power. Britain ruled the world in the 19th century. The United States has ruled the world in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But both systems contained a vulnerability. They depended on conditions that could change. And when those conditions changed, the power evaporated. Britain's vulnerability was that it built its empire on a fuel source it initially controlled, but that other nations could also access. As other countries developed coal resources and as the world shifted to oil, Britain's advantage disappeared. The United States faces a different but analogous vulnerability. It built its financial dominance on the requirement that oil be traded in dollars. But that requirement is not a law of nature. It is a convention, and conventions can change. As major economies develop the ability to trade in their own currencies, as alternative payment systems emerge, as the geopolitical balance shifts, the dollar's monopoly weakens. The mechanism is subtle. It does not happen overnight. There is no single moment of collapse. Instead, there is a gradual erosion. Each trade agreement that bypasses the dollar is a small loss. Each oil sale in yuan or rubles is a crack in the foundation. Individually, these events seem minor. Collectively, they represent a structural transformation. The demand for dollars decreases. The need to hold dollar reserves decreases. The willingness to accept dollars in exchange for real goods and resources decreases. And as demand for dollars falls, the United States loses the ability to print money without consequence. The privilege of the reserve currency, the ability to run deficits without facing immediate economic discipline, begins to fade. This is not a conspiracy. It is not a coordinated attack. It is a rational response by other nations to changing circumstances. Why should emerging economies accept a system that gives the United States structural advantages? Why should they hold their reserves in a currency that can be weaponized through sanctions? Why should they conduct trade in a currency controlled by a foreign government? The questions answer themselves. The petrodollar system served the interests of the United States. It did not serve the interests of other nations. And as those nations gain the economic and political power to create alternatives, they will. They are. Empires are often understood in terms of military might or cultural influence. But at their core, empires are economic systems. They are mechanisms for extracting resources from the periphery and concentrating them in the center. The British Empire extracted raw materials from colonies and sold manufactured goods back to them. The profits flowed to London. The American Empire operates differently. It does not rely on formal colonies. It relies on financial architecture. The petrodollar system allows the United States to import goods and export currency. Other nations send real products, oil, electronics, clothing to the United States. The United States sends paper, or more accurately, digital entries in a ledger. As long as those digital entries are accepted as valuable, the system works. But if confidence in the currency erodes, the system breaks. Britain learned this lesson the hard way. After World War II, Britain could no longer maintain its empire. The costs were too high. The economic foundation was too weak. The pound lost its status as the global reserve currency. The empire dissolved. The process took decades, but the direction was clear. Once the structural advantage was lost, decline was inevitable. The United States is not at the same point. The dollar is still dominant. The American economy is still the largest. But the trajectory is similar. The structural advantage is eroding. The alternatives are emerging. The confidence is wavering. What makes this process particularly insidious is that it is self-reinforcing. As the dollar weakens, nations have more incentive to diversify away from it. As they diversify, the dollar weakens further. A tipping point can be reached where the decline accelerates. We are not there yet, but the direction is clear. The petrodollar system, which has underpinned American power for half a century, is under stress. And unlike Britain, which could theoretically have secured more oil fields or developed alternative energy sources, the United States cannot simply create more demand for the dollar. Demand for the dollar is determined by the decisions of other nations, and those decisions are increasingly moving away from dollar dependence. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. Britain built an empire on coal, lost it when the world moved to oil, and spent the 20th century in relative decline. The United States built its dominance on the petrodollar, and as the world begins to trade energy and goods and alternative currencies, that dominance is threatened. The mechanisms are different. The technologies are different, but the underlying pattern is the same. Dependence on a single foundation creates power, but it also creates vulnerability. And when that foundation shifts, power shifts with it. The lesson is not that empires are doomed. The lesson is that empires built on narrow foundations are fragile. Britain could have diversified its energy sources earlier. It could have invested in oil production before it became critical. It could have adapted its economy to reduce dependence on coal exports and coal-based industry. But it did not. The inertia of success, the assumption that what worked in the past would work in the future, prevented adaptation. The United States faces a similar choice. It could accept a multipolar financial system. It could reduce its reliance on the structural privilege of the reserve currency. It could adapt to a world where the dollar is one important currency among several. But doing so would require accepting a loss of power. And powerful nations rarely accept such losses voluntarily. The British Empire did not end because it was conquered. It ended because the world changed and Britain could not adapt quickly enough. The American financial empire may not end through military defeat. It may end because the economic conditions that made the petrodollar system possible are disappearing. The BRICS nations are not attacking the dollar. They're simply building alternatives. They're creating systems that do not depend on dollar intermediation. And as those systems grow, the dollar's centrality diminishes. The process is gradual, but gradual processes can have dramatic endpoints. The Ottoman Empire, a century before, faced a different but related trap. It borrowed in foreign currencies to finance modernization. The debt became unsustainable. Default led to foreign control. The empire lost sovereignty not through conquest, but through financial dependency. Britain avoided that specific trap, but it fell into another. It built its power on a resource base that it could not sustain. The United States has avoided territorial overreach, but it has created a different dependency. Its economy, its government finances, its military power all depend on the dollar's global role. And that role depends on other nations continuing to accept the dollar. This is a form of dependency that is easy to miss because it looks like strength, but it is dependency nonetheless. When Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for oil, it is not just a commercial decision. It is a geopolitical signal. It indicates that the kingdom does not believe it must remain exclusively tied to the dollar. When Russia and China trade in their own currencies, they are building infrastructure that reduces dollar dependence. When India purchases oil in rupees, it is testing the boundaries of the petrodollar system. Each of these actions is rational from the perspective of the individual nation, but collectively, they undermine the foundation of American financial power. And there is very little the United States can do to stop this process without resorting to measures that would further alienate these nations and accelerate the shift. Britain in the 1920s faced a similar dilemma. It could see its empire beginning to fray. Nationalist movements in India, in Egypt, and other colonies were demanding independence. Britain could have granted gradual autonomy, maintaining influence through partnership rather than control. Or it could try to hold on through force. It tried force. It failed. The costs were too high. The political will was too weak. The economic foundation was too damaged. The empire dissolved. The United States is not facing the dissolution of formal empire because it does not have one, but it is facing the potential dissolution of financial empire, and the dynamics may be similar. Holding on through coercion may accelerate the loss. Adapting to a multipolar world may preserve influence even as dominance fades. The choice is difficult. History suggests it will not be made wisely. The story of Britain and coal is a story of inevitable decline driven by changing technology and geology. The story of the United States and the petrodollar is still being written, but the parallels are striking. Both powers built their dominance on a single foundation. Both assumed that foundation was permanent. Both discovered that permanence is an illusion. The coal that powered Britain's empire was finite and could be found elsewhere. The petrodollar system that powers American dominance depends on the cooperation of other nations, and that cooperation is not guaranteed. In 1954, Turkey made the final payment on debts incurred by the Ottoman Empire a century earlier. The empire was long gone, but the financial obligations persisted. The people who had taken the loans were dead. The government that had borrowed the money no longer existed, but the debt remained. It had outlived the state that created it. This is the nature of financial systems. They have inertia. They have memory. They bind the future to the past. The petrodollar system is now 50 years old. It has shaped the global economy for half a century. But systems that seem permanent can unravel quickly once the underlying conditions change. Britain learned that controlling energy resources abroad is not the same as possessing them at home. The United States may learn that being the currency of oil trade is not the same as being indispensable. The world is building alternatives. The world is diversifying. The world is moving slowly but steadily toward a system where no single currency dominates. This does not mean the dollar will collapse. It means the dollar will become one currency among several, and the United States will lose the extraordinary privilege it has enjoyed for 50 years. The privilege of printing money that the world must accept. The privilege of running deficits without immediate consequences. The privilege of economic leverage without economic discipline. The British Empire was not destroyed by enemies. It was undermined by a shift in the material basis of power. Coal gave way to oil. Britain had coal. It did not have oil. The empire could not survive the transition. The American financial empire is not being destroyed by enemies. It is being undermined by a shift in the architecture of global trade. The petrodollar is giving way to a multipolar currency system. The United States controls the dollar. It does not control the decision of other nations to use it. The empire of the dollar may not survive the transition. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation about systems. Empires built on narrow foundations are vulnerable to shifts in those foundations. The narrower the foundation, the greater the vulnerability. Britain built everything on coal and then on controlled access to foreign oil. When those conditions changed, the power evaporated. The United States built its dominance on the dollar's link to oil. As that link weakens, the dominance weakens. The pattern is old. The script is well written and is playing out right now. The young officer who stood on the deck of HMS Queen Elizabeth in 1914 could not have known that he was witnessing the beginning of the end of British dominance. The ship was magnificent. The technology was superior. The empire seemed eternal. But the decision to build that ship, to commit the Royal Navy to oil, was the decision that sealed Britain's fate. Not immediately, not obviously, but inevitably, because Britain did not have oil. And empires cannot run on resources they do not control. The United States committed itself to the petrodollar in the 1970s. The system seemed brilliant. The dominance seemed secure. But the system depends on the world continuing to trade energy in dollars. And the world is changing its mind. Not immediately, not obviously, but inevitably, because nations do not accept subordination when alternatives exist. If the Ottoman story teaches us anything, It is that financial systems outlive the states that create them. If the British story teaches us anything, it is that energy transitions destroy empires. If the petrodollar story teaches us anything, it will be this: dependence, even when it looks like dominance, is still dependence. And when the foundation shifts, everything built on it falls. The pattern is old. The lesson is clear. We should pay attention when the energy that powers an empire begins to flow in new directions. We should watch for the moment when the financial architecture that sustains dominance starts to crack. Because that moment is not coming. It is here, and most people still do not see it.